Hey, it's Kyle here, and welcome back to our recreation of the Artemis program in Kerbal Space Program, taking humanity back to the moon and onward to Mars. This time around, we're building and flying the Artemis 4 mission with a slight twist. We're going to see how the Dynetics human landing system would have worked if it had been selected as one of NASA's HLS providers, with the build montage for the lander on screen at the moment. For our lander's core, we're using a 2.5 meter station core and airlock from the stock-alike Station Parts Redux mod, as unfortunately the Mark II lander can only fit 2 Kerbals inside it, and the alternative option requires a drone core, which kind of defeats the purpose of having the crew on board. And while this does mean someone is flying in the airlock, I'm sure they'll be fine, as long as it's not the early variant you see frozen on the screen. That game freezing was caused by something silly I did with a visuals mod. I accidentally installed a preset design for 3090s and 4080 graphics cards instead of the normal one, and it's no surprise it started chugging. Thankfully, a quick reinstall and actually reading the instructions, and we were good to go on our second variant of the craft, which worked a lot better.
A great success!
I did quite a few tests of the craft as I expanded it and refined the recipe, but I'm reluctant to recommend this design. When it comes to submissions for the NASA Human Landing System, or HLS program, the Dynetics craft is a bit of an outlier. Aside from its short and stout profile,
I'm a little teapot, short and stout!
It's using a non-centered engine design, by which I mean the engines are not positioned directly in line with the craft's center of mass. Its 4 engines are placed equidistant from the center of mass, where their combined thrust lifts the vehicle from those 4 points. In principle, this idea could work really well for short and wide crafts, spreading the thrust vector over a wider area, which can offset the seesaw effect these types of craft are more susceptible to, especially if they have unbalanced weight distribution. But in practice, it requires all 4 thrusters to provide the exact same level of thrust, fuel flow, and gimbaling at the same time, which from a technical standpoint can be quite challenging to achieve. Even the slightest variance in the output of one thruster can unbalance the entire craft, which in a landing situation could be catastrophic. And I suspect this was part of the reason the design was not selected by NASA. It's also part of the reason almost every rocket and lander design has at least one centralized engine for thrust. Not only is it easier to work with, but it's more efficient and safer with less variables to contend with. This craft took a lot of trial and error to get right, and you might have noticed that it doesn't look quite like any of the images I've been showing on screen, and that's simply because that design in Kerbal does not have enough fuel to do its job, so I've had to scale it up a little and make it look reasonable with the parts we have. But the principle is the same, and with it stacked on a Falcon Heavy, it's time to head to the launch pad. What a beautiful day it is on the KSC Peninsula. The sky is blue, the distant clouds are fluffy, and we have 27 swivel engines igniting to take us up into the wild blue yonder. You might have noticed my game's looking rather shiny now, and if you're wondering how, well, it's a few factors. First things first, I've done a complete reinstall of my game and my mods since the last Kerbal video, getting rid of a lot of old conflicting junk files, including some which caused issues for the visuals and crafts.
Sometimes foreshadowing is relatively obvious.
We have Scatterer installed along with Eve and post-processing through TUFX, which I'm working on making a custom profile for. It still needs some work, especially when in the shadow of a planet or moon, but it's getting there little by little. I also made a custom install of Astronomer's visual pack, removing some parts which will conflict with the previously mentioned mods, and the shiny new mod I mentioned earlier, which I had installed incorrectly. Said visual mod is the incredible True Volumetric Clouds mod by BlackRack, and just look at the clouds below us. There's even cumulonimbus clouds off in the distance. BlackRack currently manages both Scatterer and Eve Redux, so visuals are obviously their thing, and based on comments by a few fellow KSP YouTubers, it sounds like they may have recently been hired by the KSP2 team. This mod adds procedurally generated clouds to Kerbin, Eve and Lathe, with dust storms to Juno, snowfall on Lathe, and moving cloud flow maps on Jewel, which all just look incredible. Now I realise it's been out for a while, but there have been a few updates. The mod is currently in early access on BlackRack's Patreon, but when it's complete, it sounds like it will be free for everyone to use, just like the rest of their mods. It sounds like a very similar model to what has been done when Parallax did their version as well. They had their early access version on the Patreon and then brought it out for everyone once it was ready to go. That said, there are no timeframes on the public release yet, so if you desperately want this in your game now, it's $5 on the Patreon for the month, which I've linked alongside all the other mods I've mentioned. Considering the incredible work BlackRack has been doing for the Kerbal community for almost all of the game's life for free, and the fact that making mods is a very time-consuming and often thankless task, I figure BlackRack's earned my $5. So while I've been evangelizing being respectful to mod makers, our payload has made its way past the Kerman line of 70 kilometers and is officially in space.
I'm in space.
Our Falcon Heavy's first 2 boosters separated from the core stage to return to their launch site, which we'll come back to a little later, with our central booster being used in disposable mode so we can reach our Mun orbit. Unfortunately, this does mean it will not be getting reused and will be burning up in the atmosphere before eventually crashing down into the ocean.
That's my boy. No, my boy! Father, help!
We've circularized our orbit with our interstage booster, and now it's time to start planning our journey to the Mun, to get into that near rectilinear halo orbit and meet up with the Lunar Gateway. As we've touched on in the previous Gateway video, this mini space station will be positioned in a highly elliptical orbit which passes closest over the Moon's North Pole and then travels deep into space as it heads over the South Pole. This near rectilinear halo orbit, or NRHO, greatly reduces the periods of communication loss the station will experience when the Moon is between it and Earth, due to the increased speed it picks up as it approaches its periapsis over the Moon's North Pole. Due to the nature of its orbit and the Moon's orbit, not every pass will be blocked by the Moon either, as it travels around the Earth and rotates slightly as part of its orbit. While this means rendezvousing with the station is only possible when the orbits align correctly, it makes it easier to land anywhere on the Moon's surface using less fuel than from an equatorial orbit. And as another plus, the landing sites on the South Pole will be able to communicate with the station almost all the time, letting it serve as a relay station as well. It is worth noting that our orbit here in Kerbal is not a true near rectilinear halo orbit, as these orbits require the gravitational influence of a Lagrange point to work, which Kerbal Space Program does not really have. Because of this, it means our orbit only lines up properly every 6 Kerbal days in KSP, and that was when we did our launch. So with all that out the way, our Dynetics lander has arrived in its rendezvous orbit, and after a few orbits to line up our intercept, we're starting to get pretty close to seeing our old friend, the Lunar Gateway. But as we got into range of the Lunar Gateway to begin our docking approach, I noticed something was not quite right. Remember when I mentioned earlier that some mods had left junk files behind which had caused issues after the reinstall? Turns out maybe some of those files were needed and things were very much not nominal. Yep, the gateway is spinning like a disco ball, and its internal fuel tanks are those bits you can see spinning around the craft hundreds of meters away. My best guess is when I did clean up my game file and reinstall with the mods, something went wrong with the save state of the gateway, resulting in a rapid, unplanned pseudo-disassembly. My best guess is the parts spinning outside the craft were imparting too much rotation for the onboard systems to counter, but I'm no expert on Kraken attacks, so we'll just go with that. Unfortunately, I couldn't slow the station's rotation with RCS or gyros, and believe me, I tried for a good 20 minutes, so it was time to try something else. So after rebuilding the station, replacing the hinges, and then turning on rigid attachments and auto strut, I used the debug menu to place our replacement gateway next to the original and deleted the old one from the game. Seeing as I've already done the hard work to put the station there and it had no problems before the reinstall, I think it's a fair abuse of power. So let's get this wide boy docked to the station. And with that, part 1 of this mission is done, and that means we have to go back in time. As we launched on a Falcon Heavy, we have 2 Falcon 9 boosters to land back on Kerbal. To do this, we're using FMRS, a mod which creates save points after stage separation, allowing you to jump back in time to control previously dropped stages. So let's get these 2 Dragon boosters back to the KSC.
nice. That was nice.
Oh, this is heavy.
With our human landing system launched and docked to the gateway, we have 2 more tasks to complete in the VAB. First, we're constructing a new module for the gateway, the IHAB module, not to be confused with IHOP. IHAB will be the gateway's main habitation module, with the European Space Agency ESA and the Japanese Aerospace Exploration Agency JAXA partnering for the project. Thales Alenia Space are the prime contractor building the module, and they previously built 5 of the modules for the ISS, including the cupola. They've also built multiple ISS cargo craft, including the Cygnus, ESA's automated transfer vehicle, and the old multi-purpose logistic module, which was used by the space shuttle to deliver cargo to the station. Fun fact, the 3 MPLMs that flew in the space shuttle were named Leonardo, Raffaello, and Donatello, after the great Italian historical figures. And as that's where the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles got their names from, NASA asked the series creator Mirage Studios to make them a custom logo for the program. It's pretty neat. IHAB is expected to launch as part of Artemis 4, stacked on the more powerful SLS Block 1B, which brings us to our second task. It's time for an upgrade.
Upgrades, people, upgrades. That's how we make the dough.
The Block 1B is the first upgrade in the life cycle of the SLS, and for this upgrade we're saying goodbye to the interim cryogenic propulsion stage, with the brand new exploration upper stage finally being introduced, which changes the silhouette of the SLS, keeping it chunky for longer. With a new shape and larger fuel tanks also comes a bigger engine plate, upgrading from a single Aerojet Rocketdyne RL-10B2 engine from 1998 to 4 new generation RL-10C3s. Not only do these new engines weigh less, they're also thinner and shorter while delivering almost the same amount of thrust, which means a higher thrust to weight ratio. Oh, and there's 4 of them, did I mention that? So our thrust ratio is about to go through the roof. This is also the final flight of the remaining RS-25D engines from the shuttle era. While this means nothing for our craft file, Artemis 1 through 4 have used the old engines from the space shuttle to power the first stage of SLS. For Artemis 5 onwards, the new RS-25Es will be used, which are an expendable and more simplified design of NASA's long-serving engine, also manufactured by Aerojet Rocketdyne. The simplified design of the E-series has already reduced the engine's fabrication time, so hopefully this will bring down the cost over time, but I still feel bad about using the RS-25s in a disposable manner, considering how incredibly well these engines served the space shuttle. If only there was a way to jettison them after launch and recover them. The Block 1 upgrade is meant to greatly increase the payload to the moon weight, taking us from roughly 27 metric tons or around 59,000 pounds to a much more impressive 42 metric tons or 92,500 pounds, more than a 50% increase in the TLI payload capacity. While this is half the payload that SpaceX's Starship is expected to be able to haul to the moon, that stat is after being fully refueled, and we don't actually have any figures on how much a non-refueled Starship would be able to carry to the moon, as those figures have never been announced. So the nearest real comparison is the Saturn V, which could lift 52 tons to the moon, or a little over 116,000 pounds. With our upgrades in place and our craft stacked, we're getting close to our launch window, so it's time to roll 1B out to the launch platform. And wait a minute, rain? I thought it was always sunny at the KSC. Yes, this is one of those amazing new weather effects that comes with the volumetric clouds mod, and some pretty impressive lightning too. But don't worry, the lightning doesn't damage your craft, so there's nothing stopping us from an impressive storm launch. There's just something that's really cool about night launches and storm launches, though I guess NASA would never permit the latter of those. As we rise through the cloud cover, separate from our solid rocket boosters and make our way to the upper atmosphere, I'm enjoying the lightning flashing in the clouds below. And with this being the second Artemis moon landing, Artemis 4 is quite different. We're delivering a component for the Lunar Gateway, we're launching on a new rocket configuration, and we're also using the Gateway as the descent and ascent ingress point. While the last point is dependent on the lander used because Starship is dummy thick, Artemis 4 is planned to be the starting point for the standardization of the mission profile, with the following missions expected to follow a similar itinerary. This is essentially travel to the Gateway, transfer to the lander, descend to the surface, conduct mission on surface, ascend back to the Gateway, and then return to Earth. It might sound like a bit of a mundane detail, but it's a pretty big step in the process of normalizing a mission on the Artemis program, and it shows that the program has a direction rather than still just finding its way. So while we get ourselves into orbit and on our way to the moon, let's meet our fictional Artemis 4 crew picked from the candidates. Our mission commander for Artemis 4 is Nicole Inapu-Mann, who started her career as a Navy test pilot and holds a BA of Science in Mechanical Engineering and a Master of Science with a specialty in Fluid Mechanics. After flying 47 combat missions, she joined the Naval Test Pilot School and clocked up over 2,500 flight hours in 25 types of aircraft before she was selected as an astronaut in 2013. Mann has led the astronaut corps in the development of both the Orion spacecraft and the SLS, and flew the ISS on the Crew 5 mission, becoming the first female commander of a NASA commercial crew program launch and the first Native American woman in space. Next up is our pilot, Warren Hoberg, who holds a bachelor's degree in aeronautics and astronautics from MIT, along with a doctorate in electrical engineering and computer science. Hoberg was actually an assistant professor of aeronautics and astronautics at MIT, where he taught undergraduate courses on dynamics and flight vehicle engineering. Prior to MIT, he worked for Boeing's commercial airplanes product development and was selected as an astronaut in 2017 before becoming the pilot of the Crew 6 mission in 2023. Our scientist for this mission is Dr. Jessica Watkins, who has a Bachelor of Science in Geological and Environmental Sciences and a doctorate in geology. Dr. Watkins studied Mars surface processes and was a postdoctoral fellow at Caltech, where she was a member of the science team for the Mars Curiosity rover, helping test the Mars rock samples on board the rover and investigating the Gale crater's geohistory. She's helped with many other geology-centric missions and served as the chief geologist on 2 of NASA's Mars mission desert simulations. She was selected as an astronaut in 2017 and joined the Crew 4 mission to the ISS as a specialist in 2022. Now, before we introduce our last crew member, let's jump back to the flight where we're halfway to the Mun and are doing our transposition and docking maneuver to extract the IHAB module for the Gateway. We've got a little bit of debris from our separating decoupler, so a quick flick,
Bye, Felicia.
and we're in business. With the module retrieved, we can separate from the exploration upper stage, even though it still has an impressive 3,000 meters a second in the tank, and prepare to come over the Mun's North Pole to begin our orbital burn. While we get there, let's meet our last crew member and engineer, Dr. Jenny Sidney Gibbons from the Canadian Space Agency. Dr. Sidney Gibbons has a Bachelor in Mechanical Engineering and a PhD in Engineering, specialising in combustion. She was a lecturer in internal combustion engines at the University of Cambridge and also taught undergraduate and graduate students in the energy, fluid mechanics and turbo machinery courses. In 2016, she was awarded the Institute of Engineering and Technology's Young Woman Engineer of the Year Award, as well as the Royal Academy of Engineering's Young Engineer of the Year Award. She was selected to join the Canadian Space Agency in 2017 and was announced as the backup for fellow Canadian Jeremy Hansen for the Artemis 2 mission. To me, these 4 seem like a good balance of experience and skill sets for a second lunar landing. Nicole and Warren, having served in these roles on their mission to the ISS, are prepared for a long-duration mission and the challenges of docking to a station. Dr. Watkins is also a great choice to start the search for a moon base location, with experience as a specialist on Crew 4, and Dr. Sidney Gibbons can help with the shakedown cruise for the Lunar Gateway and test out the Canadarm3 on the platform. And as she's a backup crew member for Artemis 2, I suspect NASA want to use her skill sets in orbit rather than on the surface at this stage, and it means she's likely to be on the main crew for Artemis 3 or 4. Will I be right? Well, we've got quite a while to wait, as Artemis 4 isn't scheduled until 2028, so I guess we'll be talking about that again then. So back to our mission at hand. We've lined up our orbit to rendezvous with the gateway, and after a few mid-course corrections, it's coming into view. The first order of business is going to be docking our new IHAB module to the station, straight onto the end of the Habitation and Logistic Outpost module known as Halo. It might look like we're coming in a bit fast due to the speeding up of the footage, but we're travelling about 4 meters a second for approach, slowing down gradually to under half a meter a second once we're within 50 meters of the station. From here, we line up the pods and drift in the rest of the way, making minor adjustments along the course to correct our angle and compensate for any spin and roll we may have picked up. Because I'm so used to playing career mode with low-level Kerbals without targeting skills, I'm much more familiar with this manual style of docking rather than using the targeting controls to point the docking ports to each other. With hard dock confirmed, it's time to give the station a once-over to make sure everything's okay before the crew board the station. We do not want another disco ball incident after all. With the solar panels open and the batteries charged and ready, we can finally head into the station to have a look around. So let's unbuckle that safety harness, head to our hatch and open up the docking port to see how the station's looking. And thankfully the lights are on and the station is pressurized, which means Dr. Sydney Gibbons can get to work on making sure the station is up to scratch while the rest of the team prepare for their trip down to the surface. Now, if you're keen to float through your space station and crafts, the mod we're using here is called Free IVA. This mod allows you to get out of your seat in IVA mode and move around the ship and between parts. At the moment, the mod supports all stock and DLC crewed parts, but there are also several mods which support the feature, including the Stockolite station parts I mentioned earlier. It is very much dependent on whether or not the parts have IVA meshes and crew spaces. And as there are literally thousands of mods for Kerbal Space Program, not everything will support this feature. Thankfully, most of the mods I use do have those meshes in place, and even those that aren't perfect, such as the transfer tubes from Universal Storage 2, can still function. I'd suggest testing the fully constructed version of your craft at the KSC before you send it into orbit if you really want to make sure it all works. With all the crew now transferred to their respective crafts, Jenny can watch from the gateway window as our Dynetics lander undocks and slowly departs the station. We'll meet back up with Dr. Sydney Gibbons later, but for now, Commander Mann, Pilot Hoberg and Dr. Watkins are preparing themselves for the Artemis program's second lunar, or in our case, Munna, landing. To do this from the gateway, the lander would typically depart the station as it passed the halfway point of its orbit approaching the Mun's North Pole, with the lander starting its circularization burn over the pole to bring its orbit in closer. Unfortunately, I'd had a few issues with the craft's controls earlier, so not leaving anything to chance, we're departing early and splitting the descent into 3 burns. First, lowering the periapsis before lowering our apoapsis when we begin our closest approach. Now that we're in a nice low orbit of 11.7 and 14.5 kilometers, we can scout out our landing location, and this large cratered basin is our goal. We've got a long boy of a craft this time around, and it handles like a bus.
Cry deeply! Demand a refund!
So let's loop back around and prepare for our first landing burn, which changes our inclination to bring us over that large crater basin. You might have noticed the Mun's poles are pretty rough terrain, much like the real polar regions of the moon. There was an article doing the rounds a few months back saying we should go back to a previous Apollo landing site to test the hardware, rather than taking on the quote-unquote dangerous terrain of the South Pole. Realistically, that would be taking a step backwards and wasting a landing and launch, which could be used to really help assess the viability of a moon base in the future. And by the time we're looking to land on the moon's south pole, we'll have so much more data about the landing site compared to the Apollo programs, with a litany of satellites and rovers already assessing the best potential landing locations. As we enter the final 100 meters of our descent into the Mun's South Pole Basin, we've lit our engines and started our powered landing, contacting the surface at a little under 3 meters a second and sliding a little on the uneven terrain. With our craft landed and stable on the surface, let's get those solar panels out and the lights on before the crew suit up to head outside.
over here, you two, and turn over the snow receiver, it's over the sky. Here, see what's it. So, yep, little city, yep, turn over the snow receiver, it's over the sky. Here's the value, what's it. Hey, your name's Mr. Surf. Back in the shape, your name's Gun, and then back in the area, we'll tell you what's up. We're recovered, that's in that furious, but you're not feeling taking you from me, doing that.
And with that, our Artemis 4 crew have returned safely home. Another successful mission on the way to establishing Humanity's first off-world surface base. Apologies this video took so long to put out, with it coming in at 30 minutes. It really took a lot of editing and I had over 7 hours of content to sort through. Going forward, I plan to have at least one video coming out a month, with 2 where I can manage it. The aim is to keep them under the 20-minute mark, but we'll have to see how we go, as the Artemis missions will continue to get more complex as we head down the timeline. On that note, our next Artemis mission is a big one, so Artemis 5 will be another 2-parter. There's a lot to do. We need to scan the South Pole for resource locations with NASA's trusty old Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter camera and Korea's Danuri satellite. We're bringing the Esprit refueler module to the gateway. We're testing yet another human landing system, this time the Blue Moon lander, and we'll be building and delivering Toyota's lunar terrain vehicle to the Moon's surface. But before that, we'll be heading back to Korea mode and continuing the Umbra program with Umbra 2 to the Moon and back, resuming the Korea playthrough with Val's first mission as commander. After that, KSP-2's 4 Science update should be live, and we'll be visiting Jool to try and fly through its cloud layer. Will we die? Probably, but it will hopefully be more stable than the launch version of the game, with a change in the code to prevent wobbly rockets. I might also throw together that SLS engine recovery video for a laugh over December. We'll see how we go. Thanks for sticking around to the end, and until next time, thank you so much for watching, and I'll catch you on the next pass.